You often speak as if knowing something grants authority. When an idea appears coherent, you treat it as truth. When a belief feels stable, you assume it is reliable. Certainty becomes a form of psychological security. Yet you rarely question what certainty actually rests upon. This is the point where Al-Ghazali begins. He noticed that people defend their certainties not because they understand truth, but because these certainties support their sense of who they are. What appears as love for knowledge is often attachment to identity. Certainty becomes a mask the ego wears to appear confident. You start to wonder whether your own conviction arises from clarity or from habit. If certainty is meant to free the mind, why does it so often imprison the self? Al-Ghazali lived in a city where claims to truth were everywhere. Baghdad hosted philosophers who built intricate systems of logic, theologians defending doctrine with precision, and mystics asserting inner illumination. Each group insisted that its own method provided the final certainty. Amid this intellectual competition, Al-Ghazali observed that the pursuit of truth had become intertwined with the pursuit of authority. Certainty was used less as a guide and more as a declaration of superiority. In such an environment, the question was not which idea was true, but which identity it reinforced. If everyone insists they alone possess truth, does anyone actually seek it? Al-Ghazali eventually confronted the fragility of all the forms of knowledge that surrounded him. The senses could deceive, as many thinkers had shown. Rational arguments could be logically valid yet contradict one another. And inherited beliefs, even when sincere, relied on unexamined trust. When these pillars began to wobble, Al-Ghazali realized he had mistaken confidence for certainty. You begin to see the same issue within yourself. Many of your convictions were never tested. They simply grew into you by repetition. The collapse of assumed knowledge is unsettling but revealing. Certainty often hides not truth but uncertainty. If doubt exposes the weakness of knowledge, what exposes the weakness of doubt? You start to look closely at the feeling of certainty itself. When you say, "I know," something inside settles. But what is it that settles, the mind or the ego? Al-Ghazali observed that the ego quietly feeds on conviction. It uses certainty as a way of preserving identity. A belief becomes more than an idea. It becomes a part of the self. When you cling to a belief, the intensity of your defense often reveals more about your attachment than about the truth of the belief. The ego fears losing certainty because uncertainty weakens its structure. Knowledge becomes less about understanding and more about self-protection. Al-Ghazali warned that this transformation is subtle. A belief that begins as inquiry can become a shield. You do not defend the truth, you defend the version of yourself built around it. If certainty strengthens the ego, can it ever strengthen understanding? Conviction becomes dangerous when it stops being questioned. Al-Ghazali saw that once people accept an idea as absolute, they stop examining it. Contradictory evidence is dismissed, and alternative perspectives are labeled as threats. The belief becomes immovable not because it is true but because the ego depends on it. You begin to notice this mechanism within yourself. When an idea feels familiar, you treat it as correct. When a belief is shared by many, you assume it must be valid. Certainty becomes emotional rather than rational, even though you may still justify it with arguments. The need to preserve identity silently directs your reasoning. Al-Ghazali insisted that the mind becomes blind not because the world lacks clarity but because the self has already chosen what it wants to see. Familiar ideas sustain psychological comfort. Unfamiliar ideas require change. The ego avoids change. If conviction blinds you to error, how can conviction guide you to truth? Al-Ghazali eventually turned to doubt, not as rejection, but as purification. Doubt, in his view, clears away illusions created by attachment. It challenges the ego's assumption that its convictions are unquestionable. By doubting the beliefs he had inherited, he uncovered the way ego had intertwined with understanding. You see that doubt can serve a similar function for you. When you examine a belief you consider certain, you start to see which parts belong to truth and which parts belong to identity. Doubt separates the two. It invites humility by revealing how much of your certainty was built on assumption. For Al-Ghazali, doubt was not an endpoint but a tool. By exposing false certainty, it makes genuine understanding possible. But he also realized that doubt itself could become an attachment, a new identity claiming superiority through skepticism. If doubt removes false certainty, what removes false doubt? At this stage, Al-Ghazali arrived at a deeper insight. Truth cannot be owned. The moment you try to claim it as mine, you distort it. Ownership transforms knowledge into identity. The ego begins to use truth as property, as something that elevates or validates the self. You begin to recognize the distinction. There is awareness, which simply sees, and there is ownership, which turns seeing into possession. When you observe your own mind carefully, you notice that awareness is impartial. It does not defend one idea over another. It reveals thoughts but is not defined by them. Al-Ghazali argued that the clearest truths arise when the self stops interfering. When awareness operates without ownership, understanding becomes transparent. But when the ego takes hold of insight, it uses it as a badge of superiority, even if unconsciously. You see the difficulty. The very moment you recognize something true, the ego wants to insert itself. It wants to say, I understood this, turning insight into identity. If truth becomes distorted when claimed, how can it ever be claimed without distortion? Once Al-Ghazali recognized the difference between ego-driven certainty and genuine understanding, a new form of clarity emerged. This clarity did not come from argument or persuasion. It came from a shift within the seeker. When the ego's grip loosened, awareness could operate freely. You begin to experience this distinction. Some truths feel quiet rather than triumphant. They do not inflate identity, they simply illuminate. These insights do not require defense because they do not belong to you. They appear as recognition rather than possession. Al-Ghazali emphasized that honest understanding is humble. It does not demand agreement. It does not seek validation. It does not depend on superiority. It is free precisely because it does not serve the ego. In this state, certainty feels different. It is not rigid or aggressive. It is steady and silent. It does not argue, it clarifies. If true certainty needs no defense, why do we defend it? Al-Ghazali observed that once false certainty dissolves, the ego loses one of its main sources of strength. Intellectual pride collapses. The sense of being exceptional, of standing above others through knowledge, disappears. This collapse is unsettling but necessary. You begin to see why. Pride requires hierarchy. It requires the belief that your views are superior and that others are misguided. As long as this hierarchy persists, you cannot approach truth sincerely. Inquiry becomes a competition rather than an exploration. When certainty is no longer owned, pride has nothing to attach itself to. What remains is a quieter form of seeking, one that listens more than it asserts. Al-Ghazali believed that this humility is the gateway to genuine understanding. Without it, every argument becomes a performance of identity. If pride falls when certainty falls, why cling to what makes both unstable? Al-Ghazali eventually distinguished between two kinds of certainty. The first is the ego's certainty, rigid, defensive, and rooted in identity. The second is a certainty that arises from clarity itself. This certainty is not possessed, it is recognized. You start to sense the difference. Ego-driven certainty says, "This is true because I believe it." Genuine certainty says, "This is true because it cannot be denied." The first reinforces the self, the second loosens its grip. Al-Ghazali saw that the second kind of certainty is transformative precisely because it does not depend on who holds it. It stands on its own. If certainty frees you only when it stops belonging to you, can you ever say you have it? As the ego's attachment to certainty weakens, the mind grows quiet. You no longer need knowledge to validate your identity. You no longer present understanding as proof of superiority. The noise of self-assertion fades. In this quiet, understanding becomes a subtle presence rather than a possession. You notice that clarity does not need to be proclaimed. It simply remains, unaffected by agreement or disagreement. Al-Ghazali believed that this silence marks the shift from intellectual pride to genuine insight. The mind no longer grasps, it observes. If knowledge is clearest when unclaimed, what remains of the one who tries to claim it? Now the inquiry arrives at its final stage. Certainty is no longer an assertion or a trophy. It is not something the ego holds. It is the clarity that appears when the self no longer interferes. Awareness stands on its own, needing no approval, needing no defense. You find that truth does not need the seeker to claim it. It remains even when the seeker grows silent. Understanding becomes the quiet ground on which thought arises and dissolves. In this stillness, knowing is not an act. It is a condition. If understanding appears only when the seeker falls silent, what was the seeker searching for?